They're stealing from me, son, and when I'm gone, they're going to blame Ruth." The old man's voice crackled out of the phone, thin and shaking, echoing across a silent funeral parlor. David Coleman stood frozen with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to his dead father speak, a voicemail left 31 days ago that David had never once bothered to play. And in that recording, in the last clear words his father ever spoke to him, Walter Coleman named the person who had been robbing him blind. It was not the woman they had already fired. Ruth Hensley had given 20 years of her life to Magnolia Grove, and they walked her out the front door in less than 15 minutes. She did not shout. She did not weep in front of them. She had spent 2 decades teaching frightened families how to keep their composure in the hardest hours of their lives, and now she called on every ounce of that training, just to keep her chin steady. She carried a single cardboard box, a coffee mug, a cardigan she kept on the back of her chair for the residents who were always cold, and a small potted African violet that had bloomed on her station windowsill for 11 years. At the automatic doors, she paused and looked back, not at the director who had accused her, but at the long hallway she had walked 10,000 mornings. Room 14, where she'd held Mr. Abernathy's hand when he passed. Room 22, where Mrs. Liu still asked for her by name. And room 9, Walter's room. Empty now. Both of them gone, in the same terrible week. Then Ruth Hensley, 62 years old, straightened her shoulders and stepped out into the cold parking lot, and the doors slid shut behind her with a soft mechanical sigh, as if the building itself had decided she had never mattered at all. What none of them knew, not the director, not the corporate men in their pressed suits, not even Ruth herself, was that an 84-year-old man had already told the truth. He had spoken it into a telephone weeks before he died, in a moment of clarity that flickered up through the fog like the last light of a candle. He had reached out to the one person who should have answered, and that person had let it go to voicemail. "Hello there, friend. Welcome back. Before we begin tonight, I just want to take a moment and thank you, every single one of you, for pulling up a chair and spending this time with me. There's something about a good story at the end of a long day, isn't there? It reminds us that the world still turns on the small, quiet decencies that don't make the news. Do me a kindness before we start. Wherever you are tonight, your town, your state, the country you're calling home, tell me down in the comments. I love knowing just how far these stories travel, and how many good hearts are out there listening in the quiet. Now settle in. Get your tea, get your blanket, find your favorite chair, because tonight's story is one I've been wanting to tell you for a long while. It's about a woman who gave her whole life to caring for other people's mothers and fathers. It's about an old man that the world had already decided to stop listening to. And it's about a truth that refused to stay buried, even after the man who spoke it was gone. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever loved someone the whole world had written off? Have you ever been the only one still willing to sit with a person, hold their hand, and treat them like they still mattered, long after everyone else had looked away? Hold on to that feeling. You're going to need it tonight. Magnolia Grove Senior Living sat at the edge of a small Ohio town, a low brick building surrounded by oak trees, and a garden that Ruth Hensley had helped plant with her own 2 hands, back when the place first opened its doors. It was owned, on paper, by a corporation 3 states away, a company called Meridian Senior Care, whose name appeared on the letterhead and the paychecks, and almost nowhere else. The men who owned it had never once knelt beside a resident's bed. They knew the place only as a line on a spreadsheet. But to Ruth, it was never a line on anything. It was a calling. Ruth had come to this work the way a lot of good people come to it, through her own grief. Her mother had spent her final years in a place not so different from Magnolia Grove, and Ruth had watched, helpless and young, as some aides treated her mother like a chore, and others treated her like a person. She had promised herself, standing at her mother's graveside at the age of 30, that she would spend the rest of her life being the second kind. She kept that promise for 32 years. She raised 2 children on a nurse's wages, mostly alone after her husband Gerald's heart gave out when the kids were still in grade school. She buried her grief in double shifts and quiet dignity, and she poured whatever was left of her heart into the people society had tucked away and forgotten, She learned which residents liked their coffee sweet. She learned who had nightmares, and who liked the hallway light left on, and who just needed someone to sit with them in the dark for a few minutes, so they wouldn't feel so alone. By the time she was 62, Ruth Hensley was the soul of that building. New aides were told on their first day, "Whatever you do, watch how Ruth does it." Families requested her by name, and she was 3 years, just 3 years, from the retirement she and Gerald had once dreamed about together, back when they still believed they'd grow old side by side. And then, 4 years ago, a widower named Walter Coleman moved into room 9. Walter Coleman was 80 when he arrived, and he did not want to be there. He'd been a machinist for 41 years, a man who could take apart an engine, blindfolded, and put it back together better than new. He'd built his own house with his own hands. He'd been married to the same woman, Eleanor, for 53 years, and when Eleanor passed, something in Walter had quietly folded up and gone still, the way a house goes still when the last light is turned off. His son David had moved him into Magnolia Grove after the second fall, the one that broke his hip. David lived 4 hours away in the city, running a construction and development company that had made him a wealthy and important man, the kind of man whose name was on buildings, whose calls got returned within the hour, whose calendar was managed by 2 assistants. David loved his father. He told himself that often. He simply never seemed to have the time to prove it. So Walter arrived at Magnolia Grove angry and grieving and utterly alone, and he made himself difficult on purpose, the way proud men sometimes do when they're frightened. He barked at the aides. He refused his meals. He told anyone who'd listen that he didn't belong there. Everyone gave him a wide berth. Everyone except Ruth. Ruth sat down beside his bed that first week, uninvited, and she didn't try to cheer him up or manage him. She just asked him about Eleanor, and Walter, who had not spoken his wife's name out loud in weeks, looked at this quiet, steady woman with kind eyes, and something in him cracked open. He talked for 2 hours. Ruth missed her whole break and never said a word about it. After that, they were friends. Real friends. The unlikely, deep kind of friendship that sometimes blooms in the last chapter of a life. Ruth learned that Walter kept a photograph of Eleanor on his nightstand and said good morning to it every day. She learned that he'd hidden a small tin box in his sock drawer that held Eleanor's wedding ring and a few $100s in cash. Money he was saving, dollar by dollar, so he'd have something to give his 2 grandchildren at Christmas. A man ought to have something to leave, he told Ruth. Even a small something. It's about the leaving, not the amount. She learned that he was sharper than anyone gave him credit for, that on his good days, Walter Coleman could still solve a crossword faster than she could still tell a joke that made the whole dining room laugh. But she also watched, over 4 years, as the good days grew fewer, as the fog rolled in more often and stayed longer, as Walter began to forget the names of the aides, and then, sometimes, her own name, and finally, on the very worst days, his own. Through all of it, Ruth never once treated Walter Coleman like a man who had stopped mattering. And that, in the end, was exactly why they chose her to blame. The trouble began quietly, the way trouble so often does. It started about 8 months before Walter died. One afternoon, Ruth found him upset, going through his sock drawer with shaking hands. "It's gone, Ruthie," he said. "The money. Some of it's gone. I counted it. I always count it." Ruth helped him look. She checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the nightstand, and she did find that the tin box seemed lighter than she remembered, but Walter was having a foggy week, and the truth was, on foggy weeks, Walter sometimes hid things himself and forgot where. So Ruth did what any of them would have done. She reassured him, tucked the box back in the drawer, and made a note in his file. "Resident reports missing money. Possible confusion. We'll monitor." She didn't think much more of it. She should have. That was the beginning. Over the following months, it happened again. And again. A 20 here, a 50 there. Then one morning, Walter grabbed her wrist, and his eyes were as clear and frightened as she'd ever seen them. "Ruthie," he whispered. "Somebody comes in at night. I hear them. They open my drawer. I'm not crazy, Ruthie. I know what everybody thinks, but I'm telling you, somebody is coming into my room in the dark and taking Eleanor's things." Ruth's heart broke. because she believed him, and because she knew exactly how the world would receive that belief. She took it straight to the director. She filled out an incident report. She asked, plainly, that they review the situation. The director's name was Marlene Voss. Marlene had been running Magnolia Grove for a little over 2 years by then. She was efficient, polished, and always had an answer ready. She wore tailored blazers and a small silver clipboard she carried everywhere, and she had a way of smiling at families that made them feel handled rather than heard. Corporate loved her, because her numbers were clean and she never bothered them with problems. When Ruth brought her Walter's report, Marlene barely glanced at it. "Ruth," she said, in that patient, faintly condescending tone she used with the older staff, "Mr. Coleman has advanced cognitive decline. You know that better than anyone. He misplaces things and then believes they were taken. It's textbook. We can't go accusing our own staff, or worse, our other residents, based on the confusion of a man who can't remember what he had for breakfast." She slid the report into a drawer. "I'll handle it. Don't file any more of these. It only upsets the families if they hear about it." And that was that. The report went into a drawer and never came out again. Ruth wanted to push harder, but she was one aging nurse with no power, and Marlene Voss held her job, her schedule, and her pension in the palm of one manicured hand. So Ruth did the only thing she could. She started keeping her own quiet watch. She started checking Walter's tin box at the start and end of every shift, and writing the amount on a scrap of paper she kept in her own pocket. And she started spending even more time in room 9, so that Walter would never feel as alone and unheard as she suspected he truly was. What Ruth did not know, what none of them knew, was that on one of his clearest evenings, in the fading light of a spring day, Walter Coleman had picked up the old flip phone his son had given him, and he had called David. David didn't answer. He was in a meeting. He was always in a meeting. So Walter left a message, and then, being an old man whose memory was slipping, he forgot he'd ever left it. Walter Coleman died on a Thursday morning in late October, quietly, in his sleep, with the photograph of Eleanor on the nightstand beside him. It was Ruth who found him. She came in at the start of her shift with his coffee, the way she had 1,000 times, and she knew the moment she stepped through the door. She set the coffee down, and as she sat, and it's Billy, and she held the hand of her friend, already gone, and she wept, not the composed, professional tears of 20 years in this work, but real ones, the tears of a person who has lost someone they truly loved. Then she did her job. She straightened his blanket. She combed his thin white hair the way he liked it. She made sure that when his family came, Walter Coleman would look like the dignified man he had always been. She placed Eleanor's photograph in his folded hands. And she checked, out of 2 decades of pure habit, that his tin box was still in the sock drawer. It was there, but it was empty. The ring was gone. All the cash was gone. Every last dollar Walter had saved for his grandchildren's Christmas, gone. Ruth stood there in the quiet room, holding an empty tin box, and a cold understanding settled over her. Because the timing told a story, if you knew how to read it. Someone had been taking small amounts for months, careful amounts an old man's failing memory could be blamed for. But now, Walter was gone. There would be no more confusion to hide behind. So whoever it was had made one final decision. Take it all, take it now, while the room was about to be cleared anyway, and let the death cover the theft. Ruth reported it immediately, exactly as she was trained to. She went straight to Marlene Voss's office, still shaking from finding Walter, and she said, "The box is empty. Eleanor's ring, all the cash, it's all gone. Marlene, this proves it. Somebody has been stealing from that man for months, and now they've cleaned him out. We have to call the family and the authorities." Marlene Voss looked up from her silver clipboard, and something moved behind her eyes. Something quick and cold that Ruth would only understand much later. "Ruth," Marlene said slowly, "sit down." David Coleman arrived that afternoon to bury his father. He came in a beautiful gray suit, 4 hours late, apologetic and grief-stricken, and completely overwhelmed in the way that busy, powerful men so often are when death finally forces them to stop moving. He signed the papers. He accepted the condolences. He stood in the doorway of room 9 and looked at the bed where his father had died. a bed he had visited only 4 times in 4 years, and the guilt hit him so hard he had to steady himself against the doorframe. Marlene Voss appeared at his side almost instantly, all warmth and sympathy, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Mr. Coleman," she said gently, "I am so very sorry for your loss. Your father was a wonderful man." She paused and let a delicate, troubled expression cross her face. "I hate to burden you with this at such a difficult time, but there's something you need to know. It appears that some of your father's belongings have gone missing. Some cash, and, I'm afraid, your late mother's wedding ring." David's grief turned in an instant to something harder. "Missing? Missing how?" Marlene lowered her voice, the way people do when they're about to hand you a knife and tell you it's a gift. "We take these matters extremely seriously," she said, "and I'm afraid our internal review points in a very painful direction. Your father's primary nurse, a woman named Ruth Hensley, had more access to his room than any other staff member, unsupervised access, daily. For years." She shook her head sadly. "I never wanted to believe it of her, but the pattern is undeniable. Small amounts, over many months, always from Mr. Coleman, always blamed on his confusion. And now, on the very day he passes, everything of value is gone. I'm so sorry, Mr. Coleman. I truly am." And David Coleman, exhausted, grief-blind, desperate for something to do with the terrible, helpless anger of a son who feels he failed his father, believed her. Of course he did. She was the director. She wore the blazer. She carried the clipboard. She spoke with authority, and she was giving him exactly what a drowning man in his grief was reaching for. Someone to blame that wasn't himself. "Do whatever you have to do," David said, his jaw tight. "Fire her. Report her. I don't care. She robbed a dying old man." Marlene Voss nodded gravely, and beneath her sorrowful expression, something quietly, coldly relaxed. It had worked. They fired Ruth Hensley the next morning. They did it fast, and they did it clean, the way you do a thing you don't want anyone looking at too closely. Marlene called her into the office, and 2 men from corporate were already there, men Ruth had never met, in suits that cost more than her monthly paycheck, with a folder open on the desk and their faces already set. "Ruth," Marlene began, in that smooth, rehearsed voice, "I think you know why you're here." "I don't," Ruth said honestly. "I truly don't." They laid it out for her. The pattern of missing money, her unsupervised access, the final, total disappearance of Walter's valuables on the day he died, the family's wishes, and then the word that landed like a stone through glass: termination. Effective immediately. Pending a report to the state licensing board, a report that, if it went through, would end not just this job but her entire career as a nurse, and quite possibly her pension along with it. Ruth sat very still and listened to 20 years of her life being described as a crime. "I loved that man," she finally said, her voice quiet and steady. "I was the one who found the money missing. I was the one who reported it. To you, Marlene. 8 months ago. You put my report in a drawer and told me to stop filing them. Pull it out. Show these gentlemen my report. It has my name on it and the date." For just a fraction of a second, Marlene Voss went still. "There is no report," Marlene said smoothly. "You never filed one. If you'd had genuine concerns, Ruth, you would have followed procedure." And that was the moment Ruth understood, fully and completely, what was happening to her. There was no report anymore. Marlene had made sure of it. It was her word. An ordinary aging nurse with no power and no lawyer and no one to call, against the polished director with the clean numbers and the corporate backing. She knew how that math worked. She had watched it work against people her whole life. Ruth did not beg. She did not raise her voice. She looked at the 2 men in their expensive suits, and she looked at Marlene Voss, and she said only this: "I know I didn't do it. And Walter knew who did. He told me somebody was coming into his room at night. I believed him when nobody else would." She stood and gathered her small dignity around her like a coat. "You can take my job. You can even try to take my name. But you cannot make me have done a thing I did not do. And I have found in 62 years that the truth has a way of outlasting the people who bury it." Then Ruth Hensley walked out of the office, packed a single cardboard box, and left the building she had given her life to, with an African violet in her hands, and her head held high. What would you have done, standing where Ruth stood, accused of the one thing that violated everything you believed in, theft from the very people you'd sworn to protect, by someone you couldn't fight, in front of people who'd already made up their minds? Ruth Hensley walked out of that building believing the truth was gone forever, buried in an unmarked grave right alongside her friend. She didn't know that Walter had left it behind. She didn't know it was sitting, at that very moment, in a voicemail box on David Coleman's phone, a message 31 days old, one unheard notification among the hundreds a busy and important man ignores every single week. She didn't know that the truth was still there, waiting for someone, finally, to listen. David Coleman buried his father on a cold, bright Saturday, and he did it badly, which is to say, like a man who has been running so fast for so long that he has forgotten how to stand still and simply feel a thing. He gave a short eulogy that felt hollow in his own mouth. He shook the hands of people who had known his father better than he had. He watched his 2 teenage children cry for a grandfather they'd barely gotten to know, because their father had always been too busy to make the 4-hour drive, and the guilt of that pressed down on him like a hand on the back of his neck. After the service, back at the small reception in the funeral home, David slipped away to a quiet side room to catch his breath, and with nothing else to do with his hands, he pulled out his phone. That was when he saw it. A voicemail notification, buried deep in his list, from a number saved simply as DAD. The date beside it was from a month ago, late September. He had never played it. David's chest tightened. He remembered, dimly, seeing a missed call from his father around then, and thinking, I'll call him back tomorrow. He remembered that tomorrow had turned into a merger negotiation, and then a business trip, and then 100 other more important things. He had never called back. His father had died with a message from him sitting unheard on his son's phone. With a hand that was not quite steady, David Coleman pressed play and lifted the phone to his ear. For a moment, there was only static and the sound of an old man breathing, and then Walter's voice, thin and tired, but clear, clearer than David had heard it in years, one of those last flickering good evenings. Davy? Davy, it's your dad. I don't know if I'm doing this right, this dang phone. David's eyes filled instantly. He hadn't heard his father's voice in weeks. Listen, son, I need you to hear me, and I need you to not think I'm just an old fool who's lost his marbles. Because I know that's what they all think here. But I'm having a clear night, Davy, and I need you to listen while I've got it. A pause, a shaky breath. Somebody's been stealing from me, son. From my room. For months now. They come at night. First it was money. The money I'm saving for the kids for Christmas. And now, Walter's voice broke, and David's heart broke right along with it. Now they've taken your mother's ring, Davy. Eleanor's wedding ring. It was in my box and now it's gone. And I know I didn't lose it. I know it. David gripped the edge of the table. I've watched, son. On my good nights I stay awake and I watch. And I've seen who it is. Walter's voice dropped, urgent and clear. It's that Voss woman, the director, the one with the little silver clipboard, always smiling. She comes in when she thinks I'm sleeping and she goes through my drawer. I've seen her 3 times now with my own eyes. It's her, Davy. It's Marlene Voss. The room seemed to tilt around David Coleman. And son, this is the important part, so you listen to me good. Walter's voice was fierce now. Fierce with the protective love of an old man spending the last of his strength on someone else. When I'm gone, and I know I'm going soon, they are going to try to blame Ruth, my nurse, Ruth Hensley. And Davy, you cannot let them do that. Ruth is the finest, kindest soul in this whole place. She's the only one who ever treated me like I was still a man and not a chore. She believed me when nobody else did. She is not a thief, Davy. Do you hear me? If they come to you and they point at Ruth, you tell them their own director is the one who did it. You promise me, son. You promise me you'll protect Ruth. Another long, tired breath. That's all I wanted to say. Well, that, and I love you, son. I know you're busy. I know you've got your big life. I'm proud of you. I just wish you'd come see your old man a little more. It gets lonely here, Davy. But that's all right. That's all right. You come when you can. I love you. Good night, son. The message ended. David Coleman stood alone in a side room of a funeral home, 30 feet from his father's flowers, and he played the message again, and then a third time. And on the third time, when he heard his father say, "I just wish you'd come see your old man a little more," a sound came out of David Coleman that he had not made since he was a small boy. A raw, broken sound of grief and shame and love, all tangled together. His father had reached out. In one of his last clear moments on this earth, Walter Coleman had picked up a telephone to protect an innocent woman and to tell his son he loved him. And David had let it go to voicemail. He wiped his face, he straightened his jacket, and a cold, hard resolve settled over him, burning away the fog of grief. He had failed his father in life. He had ignored the man for 4 years, and ignored his final call for a month. He would not fail him in this. "All right, Dad," David whispered to the empty room. "All right, I'm listening now." David Coleman was a powerful man, and for the first time in a long time, he was about to use that power for something that mattered. He did not storm back to Magnolia Grove that night in a rage. Walter Coleman had raised his son better than that, and David, who had built a career on knowing that accusations without proof are worthless, understood that a grieving man's word and an old voicemail could still be waved away as the confusion of the dying. Marlene Voss had already made one nurse's report vanish. She would make a voicemail vanish too, if he gave her the chance. So he did it the right way, the careful way, the way that could not be undone. First he called an old friend, a man named Sam Reyes, a retired county detective who now did quiet, careful investigative work for people who could afford it. David sent him the voicemail that very night. "I need 2 things, Sam," David said. "First, verify this recording. The timestamp, the metadata, all of it. I need it airtight, so that no lawyer on earth can claim it's fake or tampered with. Second, I need you to find out who this Marlene Voss really is. Quietly." "Give me 48 hours, Sam said. While he waited, David did something else. He drove the 4 hours back to that small Ohio town, and he did not go to the facility. He went instead to knock on doors. He tracked down 2 aides who had recently quit Magnolia Grove, young women who had left, it turned out, because they couldn't stomach the way things were run. And when David Coleman, in his gray suit, sat down at their kitchen tables and simply asked them to tell him the truth came pouring out. "Miss Voss told us never to file incident reports about missing items. One of them, a young woman named Bethany, told him, her voice shaking. She said residents with memory problems always think things are stolen, and it just scares the families. So we stopped writing them up." Bethany looked down at her hands. "But your dad, Mr. Coleman, he wasn't confused about it, not always. On his good days he knew exactly what was happening. And Ruth Hensley, she believed him. She was the only one. She filed a report anyway, months ago. I saw her do it. I watched her hand it to Miss Voss myself." Bethany looked up, her eyes wet. "And they fired Ruth? Mr. Coleman, that's backwards. That's completely backwards. Ruth loved your dad. Everybody knew it." David wrote down every word. 2 days later, Sam Reyes called back. "The voicemail's genuine," Sam said. "Airtight. Left September 28th at 9:14 p.m. Verified through the carrier. No editing, no tampering. It'll hold up anywhere." He paused. "But David, you're going to want to sit down for the rest of this." David sat. "Marlene Voss isn't her first name at that kind of work," Sam said. "She's run 3 other senior facilities in 2 other states over the last decade. And at every single one, David, the same thing happened. Residents' valuables went missing. Cash, jewelry, small things. Always from the residents with dementia, the ones nobody would believe. And every time the reports got buried, blamed on confusion. Twice, when it got close, a frontline nurse or aide got fired to make the problem disappear. Then Voss would move on to a new facility, new state, clean references and start over." David's hand tightened around the phone. "She's been doing this for years," Sam went on. "She targets the residents the world's already stopped listening to. And when someone gets suspicious, she finds the most trusted, longest-serving caregiver in the building, the one who had the most access, and she hangs it all on them. It's diabolical, because the more that caregiver loved the resident, the more access they had, and the guiltier they look. Sam let out a slow breath. Your Ruth Hensley wasn't chosen at random, David. She was chosen because she was the best one there, because she was the one your father trusted most. That's what made her the perfect person to frame. David Coleman closed his eyes. His father's voice echoed in his ears. She believed me when nobody else did. She is not a thief, Davy. You promise me you'll protect Ruth. Sam, David said quietly, get me everything, every facility, every buried report, every nurse she ever framed. I want all of it in one folder. He stood, and there was iron in his voice now. And then I'm going to go pay a visit to Magnolia Grove. David Coleman walked back into Magnolia Grove Senior Living 8 days after his father died. Not as a grieving son this time, but as something else entirely. He did not come alone. Sam Reyes was with him, carrying a thick folder, and beside them walked a woman in a gray suit whom Marlene Voss did not recognize, a regional director from Meridian Senior Care's corporate office, a woman named Catherine Shaw, whom David had spent the last 2 days on the phone convincing, with evidence she could not ignore, that her company had a very serious problem on its hands. Marlene Voss came out of her office wearing her warmest, most sorrowful smile, silver clipboard tucked under her arm. Mr. Coleman, she said, I'm so glad you came back. I know how hard this all has been. Please know, we've handled the situation with your father's nurse, and— Sit down, Ms. Voss, David said. Something in his voice stopped her cold. They gathered in the largest conference room, and David laid it out, piece by careful piece, with Sam and Catherine Shaw sitting on either side of him. He did not shout. His father had raised him better than that. He simply told the truth, and let the truth do what the truth does. On the day my father died, David began, you told me his nurse, Ruth Hensley, had been stealing from him for months. You said the pattern was undeniable. You told me to fire her, and I did. He let that sit for a moment. I was grieving. I was ashamed I hadn't been there. And you handed me exactly what a grieving man reaches for. Someone to blame that wasn't me. You were very good at it, Ms. Voss. I'll give you that. Marlene's smile had frozen in place. But then I found something, David continued. He set his phone on the table and pressed play. Walter Coleman's voice filled the conference room, thin, tired, and absolutely clear. It's that Voss woman, the director. The one with the little silver clipboard, always smiling. She comes in when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she goes through my drawer. I've seen her 3 times now with my own eyes. It's her, Davy. It's Marlene Voss. The color drained from Marlene Voss's face. The silver clipboard slid from under her arm and clattered onto the table. When I'm gone, they are going to try to blame Ruth, Walter's voice went on, filling the silent room. And Davy, you cannot let them do that. Ruth is not a thief. You promise me you'll protect Ruth. David pressed stop. That message was left on September 28th, he said quietly. Almost a month before he died. Verified through the phone carrier. Untampered. Unquestionable. My father told me, in his own voice, exactly who was robbing him, and exactly who you would try to blame. He leaned forward. He knew you, Miss Voss, a confused old man that everybody in this building had stopped listening to. He saw you clear as day. He stayed awake at night, and he watched you. And then he used one of his last clear evenings on this earth to warn his son and to protect his nurse. That's the man you decided nobody would believe. Marlene Voss opened her mouth. He was demented. That recording proves nothing. An old man's fantasy. I thought you might say that, David said. He nodded to Sam Reyes, who opened the thick folder and began laying documents on the table, one after another. This is your employment history, Ms. Voss, David said. 3 other facilities, 2 other states. The same pattern at every single one. Residents with dementia, robbed of small valuables, reports buried. And when it got too hot, a trusted caregiver fired to take the fall, so you could move on with clean references. He laid down the last page. You didn't just steal from my father. You've been doing this to helpless old people, and framing the good people who tried to protect them for the better part of a decade. The conference room was utterly silent. Catherine Shaw, the corporate director, spoke for the first time, and her voice was ice. "Ms. Voss, effective this moment, you are terminated. Our legal department and law enforcement will handle everything from here. Do not touch anything on your desk. Ms. Reyes will escort you out." Marlene Voss looked around the room, at the folder, at the phone, at the faces that were no longer buying anything she was selling, and the polished mask finally cracked and fell away, and underneath there was nothing warm at all. She did not confess. People like her rarely do. She simply gathered the ruined remains of her composure and let herself be walked out the same front doors she had walked Ruth Hensley through 8 days before. But there was one more thing. David turned to Catherine Shaw, and his voice softened, but it did not weaken. "There's a second half to this," he said. "You fired a woman named Ruth Hensley, 20 years of service, the finest nurse in this building. You reported her to the state licensing board for a crime she did not commit, a report that could end her career and cost her the retirement she spent 30 years earning." He looked steadily at the corporate director. "That report gets withdrawn today, in writing. Her record gets cleared, completely. And then, Ms. Shaw, you and I are going to talk about what this company owes Ruth Hensley and every other caregiver that woman framed. Because I promise you, this is going to be made right, all the way right. My father made me promise, and I intend to keep it." Catherine Shaw, who had built her own career on being the kind of person who did the right thing when it was finally put in front of her, met his eyes and nodded. "Consider it done, Mr. Coleman. What does it take to make a thing right after it's been so terribly wrong? After a good woman's name has been dragged through the mud and a helpless old man's dying trust has been trampled?" David Coleman was about to find out that the answer began with the hardest thing of all, an apology delivered in person to a woman who had every right in the world to close the door in his face. Ruth Hensley was in her small kitchen, kneading bread dough, when the knock came at her door. She had been keeping herself busy. That was how Ruth grieved, and how she endured, with her hands. In the 8 days since they'd walked her out, she had scrubbed a house that was already clean, tended a garden that was already tended, and baked more bread than one woman living alone could ever eat. She gave most of it to her neighbors. Keeping busy kept the fear at bay, the fear of the licensing board, the fear of what would happen to her small retirement, the fear that after a lifetime of doing right, she would be remembered as a thief. She wiped the flour from her hands and opened the door, and standing on her porch was David Coleman. She recognized him at once. She had seen his photograph in Walter's room, the son who so rarely came. "Mrs. Hensley," David said, and then this powerful, important man, a man whose name was on buildings, did something Ruth Hensley did not expect. His composure crumbled, and his eyes filled, and he said, "I owe you the biggest apology one person can owe another. May I come in?" They sat at Ruth's small kitchen table, and David Coleman told her everything. He told her about the voicemail. He played it for her. And when Walter's voice filled that little kitchen, saying, "Ruth is the finest, kindest soul in this whole place," she believed me when nobody else did. Ruth Hensley put her flour-dusted hands over her face and wept, because she was hearing her friend's voice one last time, and because she was hearing him defend her from beyond the grave. David told her about Marlene Voss, about the years of it, the other facilities, the other framed caregivers. He told her the report to the licensing board had already been withdrawn, in writing, and her record cleared completely. He told her that the truth of what happened was now on the record, permanent and undeniable, and that everyone who needed to know it, knew it. "You were the only one who believed him," David said, his voice thick. "For 4 years you treated my father like he still mattered. He stopped, and had to gather himself. When I couldn't even find the time to drive out and see him. You gave my father something in his last years that his own son didn't give him, Mrs. Hensley. You gave him your time, your kindness, your belief. And when they tried to make you pay for another person's crime, my father, a man everyone had written off, stood up for you in the only way he had left." Ruth reached across the table and took David's hand, the way she had taken so many hands in 20 years of this work. "Your father loved you more than anything on this earth," she said gently. "Do you know how I know? Because on his good days, He didn't talk about his machines or his house or any of it. He talked about you, about Davy, about how proud he was. She squeezed his hand. He wasn't angry that you didn't come, son. He understood. He just missed you. And now you've done the one thing he asked of you with his last clear breath. You listened to him. You believed him. And you protected the person he loved. Don't you carry guilt for the visits you missed. You carry this instead. You carry the fact that when it counted the very most, you were your father's son. David Coleman, the powerful man, wept openly at a nurse's kitchen table, and Ruth Hensley, who had spent her whole life comforting other people's families, comforted one more. There was more, of course. Meridian Senior Care, faced with the full weight of what had happened under its roof, and with a very serious problem it very much wanted to make quietly and thoroughly right, did the right thing. Partly out of decency, and partly because David Coleman made sure the price of doing the wrong thing was far too high. Ruth's pension was restored in full and then some. A substantial settlement was arranged, one that would let her retire in comfort whenever she chose, and Catherine Shaw, the regional director, personally saw to it that every other caregiver Marlene Voss had ever framed across those 3 other facilities was tracked down, cleared, and compensated. Some of them had spent years believing their good names were ruined forever. One by one, they got a phone call telling them the truth had finally come out. Marlene Voss faced the legal consequences of what she had done, not just to Walter, but to a decade of helpless people and the good caregivers she had sacrificed to cover herself. But Ruth Hensley, when they offered to make her retirement possible, surprised everyone. She didn't want to retire. "I've got a few good years left in these hands," she told David with a small smile. "And I'll tell you what I've learned in 20 years. There is always, always another Walter. Another old soul that the world's decided to stop listening to. And they need somebody to sit down beside their bed and believe them." She lifted her chin. "I'm not done doing that yet." A year later, there was a new place at the edge of that small Ohio town. David Coleman had built it. Or rather, his company had, at his direction, and largely at his own expense. It was a small, warm, assisted living home. Nothing like the corporate machine that Magnolia Grove had been. It had a garden and a real kitchen, and windows that looked out on the oak trees. And it was built around a single, simple idea, spelled out on a plaque in the front hall, for every family and every new employee to read. Everyone here still matters. Listen to them. David had named it Eleanor's house, after his mother, whose wedding ring, recovered as evidence and returned to the family, now sat safely on the hand of David's own daughter, who had promised her grandfather's memory that she would wear it every day of her life. And running Eleanor's house, as its director, with real authority, a real salary, and the standing to make sure no report ever got buried in a drawer again, was Ruth Hensley. She was 63 now. On her first morning, she walked the quiet halls of the new home, and she stopped at the room of a new resident, an old widower named Harold, freshly moved in, angry and grieving and utterly alone, telling anyone who'd listen that he didn't belong there. Everyone was giving him a wide berth. Everyone except Ruth. She sat down beside his bed, uninvited, and she did not try to cheer him up or manage him. She simply asked him about his late wife. And Harold, who had not spoken his wife's name out loud in weeks, looked at this quiet, steady woman with kind eyes, and something in him cracked open. David Coleman came to visit Eleanor's house often. He made the 4-hour drive at least twice a month now, a promise he had made to himself, and to a voicemail he would never, ever delete. He kept it still, that message, on a phone he backed up in 3 places. Sometimes, on the hard nights, he would play it just to hear his father's voice. "I love you, son. I know you're busy. I'm proud of you." He understood now, in a way he never had before, the thing his father had been trying to teach him with his last clear words. He'd understood it standing in that funeral home. He understood it deeper every time he made the drive. Walter Coleman had spent his life building things with his hands, engines, houses, a family. And in the end, from a bed in a place he never wanted to be, with a mind that was slipping away from him piece by piece, he had built one last thing, the most important thing he ever made. He had built the truth. He had left it behind, carefully, in the one place his son would eventually have to look. And that truth had cleared an innocent woman's name, stopped a thief who had preyed on the helpless for a decade, and brought a distant son back home, to the memory of a father he had loved but failed to make time for. All of it from an old man that the world had already decided to stop listening to. Here is what Ruth Hensley learned, in the hardest year of her long and gentle life. She learned that doing right, quietly, without applause, when no one is watching and no one may ever know, is never wasted. Because somewhere, in some way you cannot possibly predict, the good you do will find a hand to carry it forward. Hers was carried by a dying man's voice, saved on a telephone. And here is what David Coleman learned. He learned that the people we love do not need our success, or our money, or our important, busy lives. They need our time. They need us to listen, while we still can, while the line is still open, before the only thing left is a message we forgot to play. And here is the thing I hope you'll carry out of tonight's story, friend. Somewhere near you, right now, there is a person the world has quietly decided to stop listening to. Maybe it's an old parent in a quiet room. Maybe it's a neighbor no one visits, or a stranger everyone walks past. Maybe it's someone whose memory is slipping, or whose voice has grown too soft for a loud world to hear. Sit down beside them, ask them about the person they loved, and listen, really listen, while you still have the chance. Because you never know, the quietest voice in the room, the one everybody else has stopped hearing, might just be the one telling the deepest truth of all. If this story reached you tonight, the way it reached me while I was telling it, do me a small kindness and let me know with a like. It truly does help this little channel keep telling these stories, the quiet ones, about ordinary people and the extraordinary goodness that lives inside them. And if you're new here, I'd be so glad if you'd subscribe and pull up a chair. We have so many more stories like Ruth and Walter's still to tell. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Is there someone in your own life the world has stopped listening to? Someone you're going to call or visit a little sooner now? And what did you think of Walter, using the last clear words he had to protect the woman who'd been so good to him? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them, I truly do. And if you know someone who needs a reminder tonight, that it's never too late to listen, that the truth outlasts the people who try to bury it, and that the smallest voice in the room still matters, please share this story with them. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for spending this time with me. I'll see you next time.